Hello, welcome to another episode of the Tyndale House podcast. This is episode 6 in the second series of names in the Bible and the ancient world, which is series 4 overall. Are you keeping track of where we are in our podcasts? And today I'm joined by Peter Williams, who is principal of Tyndale House, and we're going to be talking about names in the New Testament. So far in the last series and this series, our focus has been on names in the Old Testament, and we just touched briefly on New Testament names. But now we're going to look a little bit more at names in the Gospels and Acts in particular. And in the next episode, we've got an episode with a conversation with Steve Walton, particularly looking at Saul and Paul and the patterns of Roman namings. So looking forward to that. So good morning, Pete. Good to have you with us. Nice to get into the New Testament at last.
Absolutely.
So, you have written a little bit about names in your book, Can We Trust the Gospels? And talked about it a little bit in series 1 of our podcast, which was quite some time ago now. One of the things you talk about in the book is that there are patterns of popularity of names that seem to be right in the New Testament.
Yep.
Can you just expand on that for us a little bit, please?
Yes, so people are able to gather data on names from ossuaries, bone boxes, and from historians like Josephus and so on, and gather a sense of what were the most popular names at the time. It's worth saying that the time period that we measure names can often be quite wide. Right. So we may be going from, say, 300 BC to, say, AD 70. But what we can say is in that period, the sort of names we're getting in the New Testament are right. There is a change after the Maccabees in the 2nd century BC, have a successful military revolution because that makes some of their names become more popular. And some of the names of the patriarchs become quite popular. Say Jacob becomes popular, where if you go through the Old Testament, it's there in the early period and then nothing for a while, and then it revives. And what it falls out is some obvious results. For instance, is that Simon is the most popular male name for a Jew from Palestine, so Judea and Galilee.
And that's because of Simon the Maccabee.
Yeah, I think so, yes. It's been around for a while. There have been other Simeons, because Simon is just simply a name like Simeon, although it's interesting because it also has a Greek meaning, a snub-nosed. So it doesn't mean that someone has to be that to get the name, but it's one of those names that works in both languages. Right. So I'm Peter, and I sometimes wonder, when I go to France, should I be a Pierre or should I just say Peter? And you can do, and you find people can work either way on this, but it gives some flexibility. It's nice to have that with a name. And with Mary becomes the most popular female name. Obviously, Mary is ultimately a form of Miriam, which is ultimately an Egyptian name. But it's, it takes on a great deal of significance, and there are various ways of spelling Mary. But what we're finding is, broadly speaking, the names that we're getting in the Gospels, they're definitely not Egyptian Jewish. They're not Turkish Jewish or Asia Minor or anything like that. They're not Roman Jewish. So they fit with the land, and that makes a lot of sense.
Right. And the levels of the numbers of names, the proportions of names within the Gospels, they pretty much echo the proportions of names within Palestinian.
They do. So although these don't reach what people call statistical significance, that doesn't mean that it is not significant. So what I'd mean by that differentiation is, the fact is, you could look at a very surface level at a story from another country, and you would just have a different palette of names. Yeah. Here you get the right sort of names. And then we get with the more common names, Simon being the most popular and Joseph the second amongst men, and a lot of the other ones towards the top of the list, that they have a tendency to add a disambiguator. So that's why Jesus has 2 disciples called Simon, one called Simon Peter, or sometimes Simon Cephas, although we never actually find the form Simon Cephas, but we presume that what it was. Right. And another one would be Simon the Zealot. And there's a question about, does that mean a zealot in a technical later sense of an actual revolutionary? Because certainly by the time that there's a Jewish rebellion against the Romans in the year 66, there are zealot means you're actually a revolutionary.
Right.
But he's got another name, Simon the Canaanite. And we can often think of that as meaning like Old Testament Canaanite with a C-A-N-A-A-N-I-T-E.
Yep.
And really, it's not that name. It doesn't have that double A. It's to do with the Hebrew and Aramaic root to be zealous, kana. Right. God is... so zealous and jealous relate, and so that's what he's called. But again, he's got that extra bit added to his name, and you find this happening again with the Marys, Mary Magdalene, so Mary from Magdala, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and this is happening in the narratives regularly. So it's exactly the sort of names that you would expect if you're using local information, and not really the sort of thing that would be easy to get if you weren't local or had serious conversations with locals. Now, there are some people that push back on elements of that argument if it's used too much as a sort of knockdown argument, and you can whittle away at it. But I think, broadly speaking, it still stands, and you've got control samples, if you like, with some of the apocryphal Gospels, which don't seem to do so well. So the Coptic version of the Gospel of Thomas begins with these are the secret sayings which living Jesus spoke and which Didymus, Judas, Thomas wrote down. And that is really twin, Judas, twin, which is not really a very plausible name at all. Yeah. And so you find that, yes, it's easy to get these things wrong. And so you would notice if they were wrong. Or if, for instance, you were reading Luke's genealogy of Jesus in Luke chapter 3, and you were to be, let's say, before the exile, and you were getting a Herod or a Philip, you would suddenly think, that doesn't really work. You know, there weren't Greeks around at that time. So that's where we find that the names just are very plausible. They work for their time and culture.
Yeah. So you mentioned the two Simons. There's other ambiguation, isn't there, in the list of the apostles here in Matthew 10?
Yeah, so Matthew 10 is fascinating because basically you can find a correlation between whether there is a disambiguation and how popular the name is. So you've got first Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother. Andrew's not that common a name, but he's explained in relation to his brother.
Yeah, it's not a disambiguation.
James is a popular name, so it's the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother. John, a popular name, but he's, again, disambiguated. Philip, actually less popular. Bartholomew, less popular. Thomas, less popular. So those all lack disambiguators. Matthew, the tax collector, so Matthew was a fair, in the top 10 names. Right. James, quite high ranking, so again, son of Alphaeus, and Thaddeus, low ranking, Simon the Canaanite, and Judas Iscariot. So Judas was about the fourth most common name. Yeah. And these statistics may vary a bit because there's new primary information to be found. So I should talk a little bit about the primary information here. So there's a lexicon by Tal Ilan of proper names, several actually, but one for this period. And she's basing that on what other people have done. So the data are changing all the time because people are coming up with new inscriptions. Every time you find a new thing with anyone's name on, that's actually changing the data. So that will be changing on a yearly basis. So
just to go back to where you started, you mentioned that this data was coming from texts like Josephus and whatever, but also ossuaries and other epigraphic material.
Yes. So anything written down, any historical record will do. They will also include the New Testament in these data. So you've got to be careful, when you can have a column of data including the New Testament compared with a column of data which is the New Testament. And so that's where you've got to be careful. But Dead Sea Scrolls, of course, give us some big figures as well. So those are the sorts of things that are feeding into that. But it is changing, not dramatically. I think, Simon's going to stay about in first place for the men and Mary at first place for the women. I don't think that's likely to change with more data, but you never know.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay. Tell us on the disambiguation thing, how the narrator of the Gospels and the things that the speech that he's recording, how those differ, because there's some interesting differences there.
There is. So if you look at Matthew chapter 14, what you find is you've got the story of John the Baptist getting beheaded, and you remember that Herod the Tetrarch has a feast for his birthday, and then he makes a rash oath, and then has to fulfill it. And what's interesting there is that every time someone talks about John the Baptist in the narrative, they say the Baptist, because actually John is quite a common name.
Right.
So you can't just say, you can't say about Jesus, for instance, in Matthew chapter 14, verse 2, he said to his servants, this is John the Baptist. He couldn't just simply say, this is John.
Right.
He's saying, John the Baptist, who risen from the dead, because that wouldn't make sense. You'd actually have to say which John, because there are probably several Johns working in Herod's palace, so that just doesn't make any sense.
Okay.
And likewise, when Herodias' daughter asks for the head of John the Baptist, she doesn't say, just give me the head of John, I got the head of the wrong John. And, so she actually is very specific in asking for the head of John the Baptist, but the narrator can simply say John. Right. Now, the other striking thing is that happens with the name Jesus as well. And it happens basically in all four Gospels, that when you have people in speech contexts talking about Jesus, they say Jesus plus something extra. Jesus teacher, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus son of David, all sorts of things that they add to disambiguate him.
Right. Two
exceptions are John chapter 9, when you've got a figure who's asked who healed you, man born blind, and he seems actually to be portrayed as sort of half seeing spiritually at this point, and he gives a half definition of Jesus by saying yes, the man Jesus did it, which won't actually help you identify amongst all the various Jesuses in Jerusalem. And the other case is the thief on the cross. And again, people on crosses don't waste words, and it's not a crowd situation. It's one-to-one.
Yeah, right.
But what you can find is in the narratives, for instance, if a servant girl comes up to Peter and says, you were with him, or you're one of them, she's going to say you were with Jesus the Galilean, Jesus of Nazareth. It's happening in Matthew 26, but straight afterwards the narrator will simply talk about Jesus.
Right.
So you've got this interesting differentiation between the way the narrator speaks and the way the characters speak.
Yep.
And of course, you've actually got a threefold differentiation really in the Gospels, because Jesus talks about himself as the Son of Man,
right,
which no one else seems to do.
Yep.
Then the characters in the narrative talk about him as Jesus plus something extra. Then the narrator's just calling him Jesus. And so it's a very interesting set of things that really, again, works if Jesus really did call himself the Son of Man, cryptically.
Right.
If he really is a figure who needs to be distinguished at the time, and it's describing the way people would have spoken.
Yep.
If you'd been in Rome, you wouldn't have needed to disambiguate the name Jesus. And if the Gospels were written 100 years into the spread of Christianity, again, you see people don't feel the need to differentiate Jesus. And it's quite clear which Jesus we're talking about. But at this stage, it would be very different. I mean,
does the name Jesus drop out of general use because of Jesus?
Yes, it does. I mean, so obviously nowadays, today we find in the Spanish-speaking world that Jesus is quite a popular name, sometimes in a compound. But in most other settings, people aren't using the name Jesus, and that's quite an interesting thing. And so I don't know anyone who's called their child Jesus.
No. No, it feels unthinkable, and yet it is, as you say, it is common in a Spanish culture, which for us in a non-Spanish speaking culture can lead to some amusing situations. But it seems an unthinkable thing for a Brit to do that.
I mean, and if I can give a sort of opposite example, and this is such a bad example, but I can't think of anyone else, is like if you had said in 1850 in Germany the name Adolf. Right. Again, there were loads of them around, and no one would know which on earth you were talking about. It becomes almost unthinkable to call your child Adolf after the Second World War for understandable reasons. So that's one of those things where you get a change where a name gets very associated with that one particular individual who becomes well known. Obviously, very bad example because of just the opposites. I'm illustrating. I'd love to have a better example, but that I think it gets the point across.
Yeah, it does.
The name Jesus becomes really popular, and then at a later stage, you don't need to disambiguate. But as we are at this stage in the Gospels, they do. And this is an amazing thing. So you're reading Luke's Gospel, Luke 24, and you've got the two on the road to Emmaus. Along comes Jesus. They don't recognize who he is. And they say, well, I don't know what's going on. And he says, what things? And they say, oh, the things concerning Jesus of Nazareth. Right. And they have to disambiguate who they're talking about. And again, that's exactly the way people would have had to have spoken.
Yeah, yeah. It occurs to me that one of the reasons why you can't think of a good example, you have to use that negative example of Adolf, is because when somebody is a very significant figure in the modern world, people will name their children after them. So there's been a rise in royal names of George and Arthur and those kinds of things in recent years, whereas they dropped out of use, but they're back in. So is the reluctance to call children Jesus within the Christian community in the early centuries, is that related to the whole idea of the holiness of the name of God?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, at an early stage in the New Testament, you get Jesus called Justus, and you bar Jesus, not a particularly good example in the Book of Acts because he's a sorcerer. But you can have others, but over time there's a sense of reverence. I mean, as in you don't want to claim this about yourself, so that's why people move away from that. Yeah.
There's an article in the next issue of Inc. by Dirk about writing the name of God and how it's. The Yahweh becomes the tetragrammaton. It's just written as in the Old Testament, and that kind of thing happening in the New Testament manuscripts as well. So
so we find as we go through church history, of course, you'll have more than one Augustine, you'll have more than one Gregory, and because once one's successful, it's sort of it takes off. But people don't do that with Jesus, and so you don't have a sort of Saint Jesus halfway through the church history. I think no. Yeah, that's very interesting. How does this is going back a little bit, but one of the arguments that's sometimes leveled against the Gospels is that somebody has invented all of this. There are multiple lines of argument why that doesn't stand up, and you've outlined some reasons for this. But why could it not be that somebody from another Jewish community, say in Alexandria or Rome, could they not have written this stuff and still have the right kind of balance of names that you talked about earlier? So in Alexandria, certain names would have been popular, like Sabbatius, Dositheus, Pappus, Ptolemaeus.
Don't see those in the New Testament.
You don't see those in the New Testament. So what you're finding is amongst the chart of the top names that they have there, those aren't making it over. Of course, in Alexandria, Jews were basically Greek-speaking. What we're finding with Jesus' disciples, we've got two Greek names, Andrew and Philip. The rest are Hebrew, Aramaic. Yeah. I mean, it's interesting the way the names line up. And of course, with our Gospels, two of the four Gospel names are Latin, Mark and Luke, which is fascinating. So you've got this mixture of languages, but it's just very difficult to falsify that and to have the mindset to do so. And if you're going to falsify a story, you don't just have to falsify and make sure you can get the right names to look plausible. You need everything else. You need the geography, you need the coinage, the weather, the trees, the social stratification. Now, this is not an easy thing to do, and the reason why is because travel is difficult and potentially dangerous. I mean, you can get robbed, you can get ill. What can go wrong when you're traveling? It's not something you do just for no particular reason. So people are generally traveling for trade and these sorts of reasons. And you find that one of the greatest geographers at the time is Strabo. And yet he can get fantastically confused. He gets confused about the Dead Sea and a lake in Egypt. And you think, like, how can the top geographer do this? Yeah. And it's because people haven't been to these places. It's a really big deal.
They rely on secondhand information.
They rely on secondhand information. And so I think, I've been once to Australia. Okay, I'm 53. Once to Australia. It was quite a big journey. be glad to go back there again, but it's not something you do lightly. And so a lot of the time, people may be very well educated, but they're getting their knowledge of geography from books. And knowledge of culture and other things. And that isn't enough actually to give them the ability to write a story with all of the right details in. And actually names are one of the things that you wouldn't necessarily think. You might think, oh, there are Jewish names. You don't think, no, there are Jewish names for this land and for that land and for that, this social stratification, that social stratification. And to actually get a bit more subtle about it, it's like if I were to ask a typical Western person to write me a story about Libya or Algeria or whatever it is, for someone to be able to come up with the right sort of names, that would be incredibly difficult. They might have some vague idea of some figures from a land, but getting the right mixture in Algeria of Berber and Kabyle names as opposed to the Arabic. There's no way you're going to do it. Sure. So I just think it's, again, it's not a knockdown proof that these accounts are true. It just fits very well with true reporting. And it's about the simplicity of the hypothesis that this is straightforward narrative. That's a simple hypothesis that's going to explain the data. Now it's over to you to try and give me something that's equally simple.
Can we talk about the name Jesus and his use of the Son of Man?
Yeah, sure.
Because it's a fascinating term, and people struggle with it because is it just Daniel 7? But then why does God call Ezekiel consistently through the book of Ezekiel, Son of Man? Is Jesus drawing on Ezekiel? Is he drawing on Daniel?
So we find in the early church, and in a sense in popular culture, it's very easy to think of an opposition between Son of Man and Son of God. Right. That's the simple way it works. But of course, Son of Man was often an expression just for a person. So in Aramaic, Son of Man, you might well just call, there's a Son of Man over there. I mean, that's it. Okay. So it's got that. But then you've got this fact that you've got Daniel 7, 13 to 14, which talks about one like a Son of Man coming to the Ancient of Days, receiving power and authority, and all nations serving him. And Jesus certainly seems to be using it sometimes in that sort of way. He will pick up the language of authority being given to the Son of Man, that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins, for instance. So that's where it's interesting. He seems to be referencing back to Daniel, reference to Ezekiel. That's a tougher one, and I'm not sure I can solve that.
That's very disappointing.
On the spot, I'm really sorry to disappoint you there. The other thing is that you actually find some of the features with the way the Son of Man phrase is used, where it actually works not just for Matthew, Mark, and Luke, but also for John, which is a bit different as a gospel,
right?
Where you find talking about the Son of Man being glorified, and again that fits with the Daniel 7 sort of reference. So I think it's a carefully chosen term because Jesus is not proclaiming himself publicly as the Messiah, because that would have been misunderstood.
Right.
And so he's able to point people to Old Testament text and expectation using this and this third person locution, which clearly, when you look at the end of things, is referring to himself.
Yeah, right. And nobody seems to question it in the Gospels. When he talks about himself as the Son of Man, I can't think of any instant where people question that use of the term.
Son of Man, isn't it? Yes.
Yeah.
But,
whereas when he's identifying himself more obviously with God or as God, forgiving sins, for example, in the healing of the paralytic, that's not so much in what he says, but what he does.
Yes.
But nevertheless, the Pharisees are up in arms about that, and yet, so the Son of Man seems to be able to work as a title that can go under the radar and be accepted by people.
And I think some of what Jesus says actually works at two levels.
Right.
So you'll see this in say John chapter 6, where a modern translation might be inclined to think, shall we talk about Father with a capital F or Father with a small f? Of course, that distinction didn't exist at the time of Jesus, and so you have possibility to misunderstand what Jesus is saying when he's talking about my Father. I mean, it even happens, didn't you know I had to be about my Father's business? In Luke chapter 2, he says this to Mary and Joseph, and they're a bit puzzled. What? What's that? So that's where I think there are, there's possibility to read Jesus' words at more than one level about Father, and you do see this sort of thing going on in John chapter 6. I'm not necessarily prepped to take you through it right now,
sure.
But yeah.
Okay. Finally, what about the significance of some of the names? In our Old Testament discussions, we've seen a number of instances where people's names are the meaning of the name is highly appropriate, and obviously that works for Jesus.
Yeah, which I want to talk about. Yeah.
So tell us about that. And are there other examples, other names in the New Testament?
It's interesting when you look at Jesus's family, and they get named in Matthew chapter 13 verse 55, where they say, isn't his mother called Mary, and his brothers are James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. Well, if you think of 5 brothers of Jesus, James, Joseph, Simon, and Judas, what's striking is there's only one of those that fits with a savior. Yes, he's the one who's going to save.
Yeah, right.
Jacob means trickster, and it's interesting that
which is James.
That's the on my understanding, they are Jesus' half brothers. Okay,
yep.
I know there are other understandings out there, and so the firstborn after Jesus is called Jacobos, which becomes James.
Yeah, and
Jacobos is just the Greek ending of Jacob, and it's interesting that Joseph's father in Matthew's genealogy is called Jacob. So it's the common thing of paponymy of you call someone after their grandfather, but you can't do it in the case of Jesus because you've actually been given a different name by the angel. So you're going to call the firstborn Jesus, and then they go on to this Jacob, Joseph, Simon, and Judas. Of course, they're all sons of Jacob, which is an interesting feature, and one's an outlier. The name Jesus, which is, of course, a form of the name Joshua, but it is an outlier in terms of the naming pattern, because there was a time when Jacob, Joseph, Simeon, and Judah would have been in the tent together at one stage, in the Old Testament, and there's one outlier name, and that's the one of Jesus. And I think it's just a fascinating thing you can try and meditate on. Yeah,
maybe that's a very good place to bring this to a close. Pete, thank you very much for your time today. It's been really interesting. Join us again for, as I said at the beginning, conversation with Steve Walton next time, talking about the patterns of names within the Roman world, and particularly Saul, and whether he changed his name to Paul, or whether that's just a different use of different versions of the same name. No plot spoilers. We'll leave that hanging for next time. So please do subscribe to the podcast, rate and review us wherever you get your podcast. That really helps us to make it known to other people. Thank you for joining us.